And now we've arrived at the back-to-back part. What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to another day in AETERNUM. Recently we talked about the new faction system of New World, and from that we also created a poll to get an idea of where everyone sat with the changes. I do have to say that I ended up being fairly shocked with the results. I had expected it to be around half and half between people not being interested and people being interested in the game currently, but it's good to see people willing to give it a chance still, even after the fact. Actually, I must say that I did want to compare it to one of the recent article polls as well. Massively OP had written one regarding New World, and at the bottom they too had a poll to vote within their community. It seems that for their 1,408 votes that they had about 36% stating they weren't too interested before the change, but now they are. I feel like we're going to have ourselves a very interesting launch and beta period. But today we're here to talk more about the dark side of AETERNUM. We've talked about the PvP side of things, but we haven't really spoken about a very important aspect that's going to affect the other side of the island, and that's the Horde. You see, a little while back when the media interviews were dropping, there ended up being a hidden one. An article written in French that contained an interview featuring members of AGS like David Verfaeli, the player experience lead, along with Michael Willett, the senior producer, and Richard Lawrence, the studio director. These three together dive into some very important details on actually quite a few important aspects about New World as a whole. They first start off by introducing themselves and going a little bit into the backstory of each of them, but almost immediately they jump right into some burning topics of New World. And one of the first things they kick off with is the inspiration of the combat system in the game. One thing that kind of amused me about this is when I first made my very first New World video back in 2018 regarding some big details revealed to the public about the very first alpha phase, I had said that the combat of New World did remind me a lot of Dark Souls. But ever since then, and mentioning it once or twice here and there, I've tried to stay away from mentioning that game because when others look at it, they tend to see more along the lines of ESO or Conan Exiles. Well, it turns out that funnily enough, the very first game they mention when it comes to the combat is in fact Dark Souls. So it looks like we don't have to debate that specific topic anymore. But they also do go on to say that along with Dark Souls, they also did grab inspiration from a lot of action RPG fighting games. Essentially, they wanted to bring the feel of an action RPG to the MMO scene. And while doing it, they wanted to take the full power of the Lumberyard engine and expand on it to create a game that even they would have fun playing. This is the part that really speaks to me as well, because if we think of a game like Elder Scrolls Online for instance, it really feels like it is a mesh between the RPG genre and the MMO genre as a whole. It's hard to explain, but I would imagine it would feel like if you took the Dragon Age Inquisition or The Witcher 3, what would we see happen from this is the question. Or more notably, what if you took a game like Dragon's Dogma, which did have a lot of similarities to Dark Souls, and meshed it into the MMO genre? It would become Dragon's Dogma Online, which actually was a real thing, and I played a lot of it on the Japanese server, by the way. It was a fantastic experience before it shut down, but these games ultimately don't feel like the others when you put them into MMO form. They feel different in the sense where you feel like you're playing a single player RPG almost, but it's just multiplied on a larger scale and you can jump in with all your friends. It feels like a lot of the reason why you can solo your way up most of the content in ESO, and that very well could have been on purpose. This game reminds me of what you would get when you mesh Greedfall with the MMO genre and also add in some sandbox elements. And I do think that the more and more we learn about it, the more I can see how it might be different from the Lord of the Rings MMO that Amazon is also working on. That part we'll talk about another day, but one thing is for sure, this is a game that certainly won't be for everybody. With sandboxes, they never are. But to jump back into the article, they then start to talk about the new additions of weapons, aka fighting styles. This is something that they talk about a little bit later on in this, but they do state that they will never stop working on the combat. And as we've already seen, these weapons must have their own skill trees, and I would personally love to see one that gets close to the lengths of a game like Albion Online. They also talk about their choice to lower down the territory wars to being 50v50 instead of a number like 100v100. And that mostly comes down to them saying that those types of battles can become too chaotic from a player standpoint, and it's less related to them not having the technology to do it. And this is a part that I don't ultimately agree with, but I can see where they're coming from. I think that you can have big battles that are filled with organized coordination. Games like EVE Online and Albion are big proof of that. I remember myself being a part of PvP squads just dedicated to using pikes and glaives back in Albion's beta phase and launch, where our job would be to pick people off from the enemy Zergs to fling them back into our army of players. And there would be many different groups in fights who would be able to strategize and effectively overpower the enemy, even if they were outnumbered. When you have more people in the fight, that leaves bigger room for error, which comes down to the group with better organization being the one that shines. EVE Online would have the same thing where you'd see squads of people who specialize in interceptor class ships or stealth bombers. As for me, I always loved a little bit of GALLENTE ships under my belt. Myself and those drones got along very well. But one thing I can see from New World is if they want to start out small, 50v50, and then work their way into bigger numbers with different PvP based modes in the future, I could see that working quite well in the larger scheme of things. They also say that they do have systems in place for groups of 5 players or even more, especially with the quote unquote flaws that open up here and there, which I do believe translates to the corrupted breaches that have also been talked about. Also, speaking of party-based content, just yesterday an article from GameStar also dropped about this, and in it they further touch on the points of interest that we'll be finding around the map, and how some of them will act as open world dungeons. This was mentioned during the PvP blog they put out where they said dungeons wouldn't be like we would traditionally expect. We won't get teleported into these types of things, but there will be bosses and areas to conquer that will feature instance loot and stronger opponents the deeper we go into them. Along with this, we'll also be coming across world bosses, but the great thing about the loot system from what we've seen so far is the fact that they mention its instance. If the loot system isn't done properly, it can actually be a huge problem for games in this genre, where players will dread through hours and hours of content just to get to the incredibly disappointing end. For more recent examples, we can look at titles like Kingdom Under Fire 2, where we as the players would do raid content and in-game content on the PvE side for days and days on end just to try to beat the RNG chances of getting higher tier troops and gear. I haven't played it since then, but this did end up being a big turnoff for players that jumped into the game, despite it also having some pretty decent combat and concepts in it. That's why I'm glad at the very least that Amazon decided to go with instance loot instead of the others. That way everyone can get their own loot and has their own chances of getting items of higher rarity, without also having to trim down the party size to mid-max their progression. Jumping past that, they also talk about their plans during the first 12 months of release, along with the question if we'll be able to change our faction during the game. Well, when I told you that we would only have access to 1 character per server in the last video, this is the article where it came from. And on top of that, since we're not able to switch factions, in terms of people flipping sides to attempt to spy or tip the odds in another group's favor, that type of thing won't be happening a lot at all. And as for their update and content plans themselves, that type of thing will dynamically change as time goes on. They will have priorities, but those will most likely change during the beta and launch phase of the game. And because of this, they don't want to lock themselves down into a predefined schedule of promises, and instead want to be able to adapt according to the situation and needs of the player. But they will still be aiming for new content added per month or even 3 months for the bigger stuff. Also, thanks to Steam, the release will be global and we will have servers located by region. But for the moment, they will mainly be located in just Europe and the US. For localization, it will be in different languages for the text side of the game, but for the voice acting, those parts will be rare to find as we journey through AETERNUM. I'm still holding out for Isabella being a real thing, by the way. I need to see her at the head of a horde of corrupted. And if she ever offers us a place at her side, I just want you all to know that I will not hesitate to betray the human race in service to the Dark Queen. But anyway, the main part where things start to get interesting is where they begin to talk about the Horde mode and the PvP war itself. Most of the mechanics we already know about the war, aside from when we do declare war, it'll start a timer of a minimum of 24 hours in advance. So if we declare war at 1 PM Pacific Standard Time, the real war itself might start at about 2 PM the next day. The attack slot will last for an hour and we get to determine that ourselves, whatever that means. But even though the translation part starts to get a little dicey here, it seems that the governor of the defending territory can choose when they are able to be attacked. I'm guessing they can choose their own vulnerability window, like my company can only be attacked between 4 and 6 PM sort of thing. They aren't sure yet if they're going to allow a day of rest for the company so that we aren't getting attacked constantly, but as we've heard in the recent PvP blog, it doesn't sound like it will be a constant thing with the vulnerability system they have going on. Just like we talked about how these wars won't be a constant thing regardless, this is why. In the middle of this article, they start talking about the invasion mechanic, stating that the way the system works is that each territory is going to be vulnerable to getting attacked by the corrupted, and there will be mechanics in place to eliminate the corruption from the area. Now, once we've taken them out, over time the corruption will start to reappear, first slightly, but more and more intensely over time. This cycle takes place in a 4-day period precisely, and this is so players aren't constantly having to deal with the corrupted invasions every hour of every day. But the cool part about this is that the corruption breaches and forts also tie into this, and if we don't clear those corrupted breaches on a regular basis, it will then make that invasion that much harder. They say that if our forts get invaded by the corrupted and we don't deal with them, it'll start making everything in the area much more difficult to manage, and if we choose to ignore it, the corruption will spread, which will result in us getting territory-based penalties, loss of levels for our constructed workbenches, our crafting levels, etc. Sometimes the corrupted breaches that come out of this can even block off regions that players need to explore, and at that point the player will have to call in help to clear them. This really makes me wonder if the corruption breaches will also affect the gathering resources in the area. Maybe it takes them away until the breach itself is dealt with. The most important part of this is that you won't ever see the corrupted invasions and 50v50 territory wars going on for the same day. So funnily enough, it sounds like as an attacking company, you could potentially use this as an advantage, or it could be a disadvantage to you. Because ultimately it sounds like you could schedule an assault for the day after an invasion is done, and if they had just had their settlement downgraded in both defense and crafting wise, they may not have the strength left to repel you. Or if the system could be used as a way to delay invasions, maybe if you're really eager to attack someone, you could essentially save them from losing to the corrupted for a day or two. This is the system I really hope we see during the beta and launch phase. There's so much potential here, and it would be amazing to see how it evolves and affects the PvP wars and day-to-day life in Aeternum. Keep in mind though that these invasions will not be going on globally at all times between the territories, so we might be able to call in reinforcements from other territories, or they could in turn choose not to assist us if they belong to the enemy faction, leaving us all to the mercy of the worst abominations on the island, and maybe even letting our fortresses get invaded so they can come in afterwards to mop up the mess. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where the dark side of Aeternum is going to come in. I imagine this is something they're preparing to talk more about in the upcoming dev blogs, maybe even tweak a little bit, but I'm super glad we had a chance to get at least some details about this in this recent article. And with that, folks, let me know what your thoughts are on this side of New World, and if you think you can trust other people to stand with you when the Horde comes, or if they'll leave you high and dry to your own devices. As always, thanks very much for stopping by, and I hope you all have a wonderful night or day. And farewell.